This is Chapter 3 of The Americans, The Growth of a Young Nation, Part 2. Section 3 begins with Manifest Destiny. And on page 131, you'll see how Americans use the idea of manifest destiny to justify taking land away from Native Americans and Mexicans. Manifest destiny meant that Americans believed that their movement westward was predestined by God. They believed that it was obvious and inevitable for Americans to take the land from the people who already lived there. Pay close attention to the section down here at the bottom of page 131 that describes the Mormon migration. This is a group of individuals who were persecuted because of their untraditional religious practices. Essentially, the Mormons, who were founded by Joseph Smith in New York in 1827, were so persecuted that they had to keep moving west to find a place where they could practice their own version of Christianity. On page 132, you'll see a map showing the American trails that led west up until 1860, which is the start of the Civil War. On page 133, you'll see how the issue of Texas and Texan independence becomes part of the American story. The actions of the Texans is part of the theme in American history, where Americans will take land from people who already have it in the name of expansion or manifest destiny. Down here you'll read about the Texas Revolution, which was brought about because of two reasons, one which was more important than the other. The two reasons for the Texas Revolution, according to your textbook, were cultural and economic differences. The Americans who moved into Mexican territory in Texas brought with them their language, English, and their slaves. In 1829, Mexico had abolished slavery. While the textbook presents the language differences and the issue of slavery as the two reasons for the war, you really have to ask yourself which of these was more important. Was it impossible for the Texans to learn Spanish, or was it impossible for the Texans to give up their slaves? On page 134, you'll read about how the Texas Revolution broke out. It is remembered by the incident of the Alamo, which was a mission and fort in the center of San Antonio. The Alamo is an interesting story in American history because it is the site of another defeat. 187 U.S. defenders died fighting at the fort. Among these were some of the more famous Americans from the western frontier, like Davy, Crockett, and Daniel Boone. What the textbook won't highlight for you is the reason why these great Americans died. It wasn't because learning Spanish was such a horrible thing. It was really that they died fighting for slavery. The war with Mexico and the United States was based primarily upon our desire for more land in Mexican territory. In order to get this land, the United States needed to provoke a conflict with Mexico and seize the land through violence. This was done by James Polk. James Polk is one of the more interesting presidents in the United States because he ran for president in 1844, primarily focused on westward expansion. When he is done being president, he has achieved everything he set out to do. James K. Polk wanted Texas to be part of the United States, he wanted California to be part of the United States, and he achieved both. The war with Mexico continues a theme in American history that war is often brought about by the wealthy in the name of getting land, but is never promoted as a war of conquest. War in American history is always justified as a defense of the country. The United States got involved with the war in Mexico by sending American troops into Mexico, then claiming that they had been attacked and therefore war was necessary. If you look at the map on page 134, you'll see what I'm talking about. James K. Polk sent American troops into this territory here, south of the Nueces River and north of the Rio Grande. The Mexicans claimed the Nueces as the border between Mexico and Texas. The United States even acknowledged that that was the border. James K. Polk sent the United States Army into the territory between these two states. Notice, this is the United States here. This is where our troops were attacked. And yet James K. Polk famously told Congress, quote, "American blood has been shed on American soil." When the President of the United States claims that we've been attacked by a foreign country, it's very difficult to argue that we shouldn't go to war. This is a theme in American history. When James K. Polk claimed that the United States had been attacked by Mexico and that American blood had been shed on American soil, a young congressman from Illinois by the name of Abraham Lincoln demanded to know exactly where on American soil American blood had been shed. James K. Polk never answered Abraham Lincoln's question. On page 136, you will see how the war with Mexico unfolded. From 1846 to 1848, the United States pretty much trounced the Mexican army. And we went all the way to the capital city of Mexico City and occupied it. In fact, some of the wealthy and powerful in the United States wanted us to take all of Mexico as a part of the war. The war with Mexico ends with the signing of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which you'll see here. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo essentially established American control over Mexican territory that was captured during the war, and in exchange the United States paid $15 million to the Mexicans. On page 137 you will see the California Gold Rush. It brought enormous numbers of people to California. What's interesting to note also as part of the California Gold Rush is that it wasn't just Americans who came to California. Word of gold being found in California brought people from all across the world, making California one of the most diverse places not only in the United States, but in the world. On page 138, you'll also notice that the vocabulary list is right here. Please continue to make vocabulary cards and vocabulary lists. They will help you out as we get deeper into the textbook. On page 139, you will see Chapter 3, Section 4 of the Americans, the Market Revolution. The main idea of this section is that inventions and economic developments in the early 19th century helped to transform American society. On page 140, you'll read about how the quickening pace of U.S. economic growth coincided with the growth of free enterprise. And you'll also see how new inventions and improvements like those of Samuel F.B. Morse helped to make new markets possible. Pay close attention to the section on the Lowell textile mills. The Lowell mills were in Massachusetts, and they produced an enormous amount of fabric, textiles. And to do that, they employed many female workers because they could work just as long and hard as men, but they could be paid lower wages. This is a continuation of a theme in American history where we will abuse minorities in our society in the name of making higher profits. Notice where it says here that the mill manager said, "I regard my work people just as I regard my machinery. So long as they can do my work for what I choose to pay them, I keep them, getting out of them all I can." Essentially, what the market economy does is it transforms humanity into a commodity, something that can be bought and sold. And young girls like this are no longer loved and cherished for who they are, but for what they can produce at the marketplace. Workers are going to feel more abused, and they're going to respond. It's an action-reaction. Workers are going to go on strike. In the Lowell mills, they went on strike for higher wages after the mills were going to cut their salary by 15%. This was the first time workers had organized to demand better pay and better treatment from their employers. On page 143, you'll read about how the workers formed the first unions. In 1834, the National Trades Union was established. This was very controversial because employers felt that workers had no rights to dictate what they could be paid or the conditions under which they would work. However, the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled in the case of Commonwealth v. Hunt that workers actually did have the right to go on strike and couldn't be fired just for demanding higher wages. Here you'll find the vocabulary section for chapter 3.4. Make sure you continue to create vocabulary cards and vocabulary lists. On page 144, you'll see the beginning of chapter 3.5, Reforming American Society. The main idea of this section is that throughout the mid-19th century, men and women embarked on a widespread effort to solve problems in American society. Some of the problems that American society was dealing with included slavery, the rights of women, the rights of minorities, as well as the rights of workers. At the bottom of page 144, you will see how a spiritual awakening inspires social reform. Read about the Second Great Awakening on page 145. It plays a very big part of Americans' reform movements, because Americans are going to use their Christian beliefs to justify changes in a free market, capitalist, and slave-based society. Unitarians and Transcendentalists were two growing religious groups who were arguing for reform in American society. One of the most outspoken and famous members of the Transcendentalist movement was Ralph Waldo Emerson. One of the early movements to reform American society is the abolition movement, which was led by William Lloyd Garrison, who had a newspaper called The Liberator. Frederick Douglass escaped from slavery and became an outspoken critic and an abolitionist leader. He wrote a newspaper known as the North Star. Also on page 146, you'll notice another rebellion. This is Nat Turner's Rebellion. This is an example of how slaves rose up and took violent action to gain their freedom. On this page, you'll notice that it talks about women and their participation in the reform movements. Pay close attention to Dorothea Dix and what she did. Also, the first time we hear about the temperance movement, or an effort to prohibit the drinking of alcohol, is mentioned here. Those are very important. On page 148, you'll also notice some very important women's leaders. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is mentioned here. Also, in this passage, you'll read about Lucretia Mott. Also, Sarah Grimke is mentioned up here. On page 149, you'll see one last picture of importance. This is Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth attended the Senneca Falls Convention, which was the first meeting of women's rights leaders. On page 149, you'll see the vocabulary list for Chapter 3, Section 5. Make sure you continue to make vocabulary cards and vocabulary lists to help you study.